So George Washington. This is where he was born, Pope's Creek in Westmoreland County, Virginia. He attended a school there, at least an elementary school, and it was called the Lower Church School. And when he was at school, he focused on learning, or he became proficient at mathematics, trigonometry, land surveying, and he became eventually a talented land surveyor, draftsman, and map maker. By the time he reached adulthood, his basic character was kind of formed. He was always known as a very reserved person, a quiet person, in other words. He didn't like to give speeches or debate. He was physically impressive. He was considered very, very strong, an excellent athlete, very tall for his time. Reports vary. There have been anywhere from 6 feet to 6'4" or so, which at that time was several inches taller than the average American. You can't really see his hair or his eyes in any of these old portraits, but he had either gray or blue eyes and kind of reddish brown hair. I mentioned he was a good athlete. He was considered, Thomas Jefferson, who knew him because he was also a Virginian, said he was the best horseman he had ever seen, which in those days was a good thing for not just sports like horse racing, but for hunting and, of course, for war. He enjoyed dancing. He enjoyed the theater. He enjoyed, of course, anything to do with hunting or horse riding. One interesting thing about him from an earlier age is he drank, but he always drank in moderation. A lot of Virginians drank in excess at his time, but he did not like smoking. He did not like gambling. He did not like getting drunk. He didn't like doing anything that might make him lose control of himself. He was kind of a very self-controlled personality. He always wanted to be kind of in charge of himself. He didn't like profanity, so he was just a very kind of quiet, morally rigid person at a very young age. This is a picture of his teeth, his fake teeth, his dentures. There are lots of, if there's anything that everybody knows about Washington, maybe it's that he wore fake teeth most of his life. But there's a misconception. Some people think that he wore wooden teeth, but he did not. The teeth were made, they were false teeth, but they were made out of either ivory or out of human or cow teeth that were, I don't know, used somehow to make these fake dentures or these dentures that you see here. They were very painful. He was in constant pain. By the time he was president, he had lost all of his teeth, or all of them but one, and he took a drug called laudanum, which I think is still available with a doctor's note with a prescription, but isn't very common anymore. It's basically 10% opium mixed with water and other stuff. And he took it to try to deal with the pain. It was a common painkiller back in those days. Washington was a very religious person. He was baptized as an infant in the Church of England, which was the official church of Virginia. He prayed privately. He read the Bible every day. He encouraged people he knew, and he encouraged the nation as a whole when he became president to pray. When he talked about religion, he used terms for God that were kind of in fashion in that age. So he would call, in his letters and his writings, he would refer to God as Providence, the Creator, the Almighty, the Divine Author, or the Supreme Being. He never referred to Jesus Christ, so that would make him not sound very evangelical like some of today's Christians. But he referred to God in various ways quite a bit. He was not a deist. If you've ever heard, deism was a common idea in the 1700s from a kind of Enlightenment perspective. This was a view that God created the world and then just set it in motion and didn't interfere with it or have anything to do with it after that. So after the moment of divine creation, just the normal laws of physics, were all carried the world forward, and God didn't intervene. Washington didn't agree with that kind of deism. Thomas Jefferson was sort of a deist. I think Ben Franklin maybe as well. But Washington believed more. He actually believed that God was directly interested in his life and in the world, and specifically in the creation of this country, the United States. So he frequently quoted from the Bible in his writings and in his speeches. He also referred to the Anglican Book of Common Prayer quite a bit. He was a notable slave owner. He owned several hundred slaves over the course of his life. And what's interesting about him is that starting in around 1778, during the American Revolution, he became very troubled about the institution of slavery. He came to doubt its moral basis, and eventually was convinced that it was morally wrong, and decided to free all of his slaves in his will. And I'll talk about that more in just a minute. Now remember, slavery was legal in all 13 colonies prior to the American Revolution. In fact, it was legal pretty much everywhere in the world prior to the American Revolution. So his change of heart about slavery began, it might have begun as early as the 1760s, but it was the principles of the American Revolution that caused him to rethink whether or not it was morally okay to have slaves. All the rhetoric about all men are created equal, began to play on his conscience and change his mind. He also had close friends during the Revolution. The Marquis de Lafayette from France and his friend Alexander Hamilton were both not slave owners and were very much anti-slavery. And so perhaps through conversations with them, he came to think it was wrong. Now, as president, he never spoke out on the subject of slavery. And he signed laws that protected the institution of slavery, and he signed laws that limited the institution of slavery. But he did not speak out publicly against slavery, even though by the 1780s he had pretty much made up his mind that it was wrong and that he was going to set his slaves free in his will. But he did not speak out on it publicly because he was afraid that if he did, it would destroy the Union, that the topic was too divisive nationally, and the United States would just break apart. He privately expressed his support for emancipation of slaves to some anti-slavery Methodists like Thomas Coke and Francis Asbury, but he also refused to sign any anti-slavery petitions because he just thought that would be too controversial. In his will, the longest part of it was about what to do with the slaves on his plantation, on his property. So the will said that all of his slaves were to be freed after the death of his wife, Martha. And he said he didn't set them free immediately upon his death because they had intermarried and formed families with his wife's slaves. Half the slaves on the property belonged to his wife. She had inherited them. Half belonged to him. And he didn't want them separated from those families. So after he died, and then after his wife Martha died, both his slaves and hers could be set free. He did forbid their sale or transportation out of Virginia, and he provided in his slave that those who were either too young or too old to take care of themselves would be taken care of by his estate for as long as necessary. And his estate did take care of elderly slaves, well now former slaves because they were set free by 1801. It did take care of several of them until about 1830 or so, when they finally had died or something. So his will freed 160 of his slaves, and he was one of the few slave-owning Virginians of his era who did set free his own slaves. And his wife, by the way, she decided to set hers free and his before she died. So they were all emancipated by 1801. This is one that I could give several examples, but just because of time constraints, this was one famous man who was a slave under Washington. His name is Hercules, or sometimes Hercules Posey, I see him referred to. He was the cook at Mount Vernon. And he was such a good cook that Washington brought him to New York City and then to Philadelphia to serve in the presidential mansion. The White House hadn't been built yet, but the executive mansion where the executive office was. Hercules brought his son Richmond with him, and they cooked in the mansion in New York City, and he made private money by selling the leftovers on the side, and he actually was fairly wealthy for his age. He made $100, $200 a year by serving food on the side, by selling food on the side, spent the money on clothing and luxuries for himself, and became fairly well known. He was punished after Washington's presidency was over. He was back at Mount Vernon, and he was caught stealing, and there was some feeling that he was caught stealing because he was planning to try to escape from the plantation with his son, and so he was kind of demoted and was sent to work on the farm, on the plantation, instead of being a cook. And then about a year later, in fact, by February the 22nd, 1797, Hercules had indeed escaped. There was a reference to that escape in April 1797. A visitor from France saw Hercules' 6-year-old daughter, who was still there at Mount Vernon. He asked her if she was upset that she would never see her father again, and she said, "Oh, sir, I am very glad, because he is free now." And I don't know where he escaped to or much of what became of his life after that, but we do know he was legally free 4 years later in 1801 by the terms of Washington's will. So he was no longer a fugitive after that. Washington, I mentioned earlier, studied land surveying, and this became one of the most useful and important skills that he had. So he got his surveyor's license in 1749. He got a job as the surveyor for Culpeper County, Virginia, that same year, 1749. And he then familiarized himself with the lands west of the Appalachian Mountains. He surveyed thousands of acres in that land and ended up buying 1,500 or 2,000 acres for himself. And these skills became very important to him throughout his life. We think of Washington in ties with Mount Vernon. This is where he died, and this is where he spent 30 or 40 years of his life. It was originally the plantation home for his half-brother, whose name was Lawrence. Lawrence was an older brother of Washington's. And Lawrence died at a fairly young age in 1752. And Washington first leased the estate from his brother's widow, and then she died, and he inherited it from her in 1761 and lived in it for the last 35 years or so of his life. Now, he first gets real military experience in the French and Indian War. And notice he's still a very young man. Since he was born in 1732, he was in his 20s when this war happened. The lieutenant governor of Virginia was this guy, Robert Dinwiddie. And before the war began, about a year before, he appointed Washington as the commander of one of the 4 militia districts in Virginia. And at this time, I think I've mentioned before, the French and the British were competing for the Ohio River Valley. So if you look on this map, you can see the red is British, the blue is French, and these little crosses refer to victories. But it was this area in here, the Ohio Valley, where they were competing, and this is where the war would begin. So the French were building forts there, the British were building forts there. This is probably too small for you to see, but Fort Duquesne was a French fort, and Fort Necessity was a British fort built by Washington early in the conflict. So Dinwiddie sent Washington out west about a year before the war began. So this would be about 1753. And he sent him first to meet with the Iroquois Indians and to kind of map out the area, learn where the French forts were, and that sort of thing. The Iroquois Indians turned out to have known Washington's great-grandfather, who was named John Washington. And in the 1600s, they had nicknamed him Town Destroyer because he destroyed Indian towns. And they gave the same nickname to Washington. So that was their Iroquois nickname for him, I guess, throughout his life. And he earned it eventually. During this trip in 1753, he met with the Indians. He scouted out the French. He met a French patrol. They did not fight. They escorted him to a fort, Fort Le Boeuf, which was a French fort. Washington gave to the French an order from the Virginia governor saying they had to leave the area, and they said no, and that was the end of the trip. A year later, he was sent back. Actually, just a few months later, but it was in 1754. So Dinwiddie sent Washington back with about 300 men, and he was now a lieutenant colonel. And when he got there to the Ohio Valley, he saw that the French had about 1,000 men, and they had built Fort Duquesne, which is more or less where Pittsburgh is today. And Washington decided to attack. And that led to the first battle of the war, the Battle of Jumonville Glen. And Washington and his Indian allies ambushed a small group of Frenchmen, about 50 of them, and attacked and killed most of them. And the French, this is a little bit of controversy about this, the French considered it a massacre. They considered it a bit of treachery. They alleged that the French force that Washington and his Indian allies attacked was a peaceful diplomatic force, and Washington sort of blamed any confusion about that on his translator. But either way, the war began here. And it ended up becoming the French and Indian War and what the Europeans called the 7 Years' War. Washington, right after that Battle of Jumonville Glen, built a hasty fort that he called Fort Necessity. And here, this is just a reconstruction, obviously, of what it might have looked like. The French counterattacked, and after a short battle, Washington was forced to surrender. He surrendered, he was sent back to Virginia eventually, and the French and Indian War was on. One of the most important battles of the war from Washington's perspective, from his experience, was in 1755. He accompanied a British general named Edward Braddock back into the Ohio country, and they had orders to try to destroy the Fort Duquesne, which is where Pittsburgh is now, and to try to drive the French out of the area. They were ambushed by the French and Indians, and they were slaughtered. Right? They lost a one-sided fight. 2/3 of the British force was either killed or injured. General Braddock, who you can see in the center of the painting of the drawing here, was mortally wounded, and Washington took over. And this became one of his first early significant accomplishments from a military perspective. He had 2 short horses shot out from under him during the fight. He was shot through his hat and in his coat, but none of the bullets pierced his body, luckily. But he organized the retreat and saved what was left of the British force. And this kind of bolstered his reputation. The next year, or later that year, he was given command of a group called the Virginia Regiment. And for the rest of the French and Indian War, his job was to protect the Virginia frontier from Indian attacks. And he did so very successfully. He was considered, from a military standpoint, one of his more successful leaders. So you can see that he got some military experience in the French and Indian War, and that would be one of the main reasons for making him the commander-in-chief of the American forces during the American Revolution. But during this time, also something really important was going on. He started his family. So in 1759, he was now 26 years old. He married Martha Dandridge Custis, who is a 27-year-old widow of a wealthy plantation owner. and they moved to Mount Vernon together. And through the combination of his estates and her estate, which was 18,000 acres, he became one of the wealthiest landholders in Virginia. This is another picture of Mount Vernon. He doubled the size of Mount Vernon's holdings, 6,500 acres, and by 1775 increased its slave population to over 100 people as well. Now, George Washington and Martha never had children of their own, and there's speculation about why he probably couldn't have children for some reason or other. But she did have 2 children from a previous marriage, and he loved them and raised them as if they were his own. So John was called Jackie, and you can see him pictured there on the left. And Martha Park was called Patsy, and you can see her in the pictures on the right, the little one when she was a child, and then the photo on the far right, painting on the far right from when she was older. Now, one kind of family tragedy, Patsy died at a young age. She had epileptic attacks and other illnesses from the age of 12 onward. And she actually died in Washington's arms in 1773. And he wrote to his friend the next day, he said, "It is easier to conceive than to describe the distress of his family. He was so distraught at her death, he canceled all his business activities for 3 months and stayed at his wife's side to console her for the entire time." So he was elected to the House of Burgesses in 1758. Remember, he's still very young, 25 years old. So he's leading the Virginia militia. He's now a successful politician. The House of Burgesses was the legislature for Virginia, for the Virginia colony. He represented Frederick County for several years in the House of Burgesses. And by the 1760s, he was one of the leading critics of British taxation policies and British mercantilist policies. And so he was going to be involved in that as well. Oh, and one interesting thing to show you how much elections and campaigns and voting have changed over the years. When he ran to be elected to the House of Burgesses in those days, the way he would convince people to vote for him was the way everybody did at that time. He would have a huge party, and he would give lots of beer and brandy to all the potential voters to convince them to vote for him. And that's what everybody did. So painting of Washington hunting. I think I mentioned he enjoyed fox hunting, deer hunting, other sorts of things. He enjoyed fishing, dances, theater. He played cards, backgammon, and billiards. He also enjoyed luxury items. He imported a lot of luxury goods from England. He exported tobacco and then later wheat to pay for these luxury items, but by 1764, he was heavily in debt. And this is a common story for the Virginians. I think the same thing was pretty much true for Jefferson and maybe for many others. The luxury goods that they coveted from England cost a lot more than they were getting paid for their tobacco and their wheat. And so a lot of these Virginians were living very extravagant, luxurious lifestyles, but going heavily into debt to pay for it. And Washington was certainly one of them. Here you see a picture of Washington and Martha dancing at Mount Vernon. They entertained lots of guests at the estate over a 7-year period from 1768 to 1775. They had about 2,000 guests to Mount Vernon. In 1775, of course, that all stopped because he was at war for the next 8 years, and he was hardly ever home. So in the 1760s, like many others, Washington became heavily involved in the fight against the British. The British angered him and others with the Royal Proclamation of 1763, which banned American settlement west of the Allegheny Mountains. He was opposed to taxes imposed by the British Parliament because Americans were not represented in the Parliament. These are pictures of the stamps from the 1765 Stamp Act. He believed this act was an act of oppression, and he celebrated its repeal. He also helped lead protests and boycotts after the Townshend Acts were passed by Parliament in 1767. These were the taxes on paper, tea, and other goods. So he was involved in all of that. In 1774, remember, the British passed the Coercive Acts, which the Americans called the Intolerable Acts. And Washington called these an invasion of our rights and privileges. He said Americans must not submit to acts of tyranny, since custom and use shall make us as tame and abject slaves as the blacks we rule over with such arbitrary sway. It was an interesting statement. Notice he's saying the British are trying to make slaves of them, and he knows exactly what slavery is like because he has 100 slaves of his own. Sort of a weird way to put it. In 1774, he was elected as a delegate to the First Continental Congress, and that year he began training militias in Virginia, preparing them for war. In 1775, the war began with the battles of Lexington and Concord. As soon as he heard about these battles, Washington left his home at Mount Vernon and hurried to Philadelphia because he knew he would be taking charge. He knew that he would be placed in command of the Continental Army. I've already mentioned to you that he was chosen to be the commander-in-chief. He was nominated by John Adams and Samuel Adams, and the Continental Congress chose him unanimously to be the commander-in-chief of the Continental Army. He declined a salary, but he was reimbursed for his personal expenses. I'm going to skip through all the Revolutionary War stuff because I've already gone through that. There's the painting of Washington here at the surrender in Yorktown in 1781 that was the final major battle of the war. I've mentioned the Newburgh Conspiracy and the Newburgh Address, but just to remind you, this is where in 1783 his officers were thinking about marching to Philadelphia and threatening Congress if they didn't get paid. And he stopped them because he didn't want the example to be set of having a military coup in the United States. And who knows, maybe he saved us from the military coups and the dictatorships that have embroiled many other nations over their histories. In 1783, he also resigned his commission, handed over his sword, and returned to Mount Vernon to resume his life as a planter, a farmer. And this astounded the world because many people just assumed that he would go on to make himself king or dictator or something like that. There's a famous phrase, Napoleon, who hopefully you all know who he was, the French dictator of the early 1800s. When he died, something, I don't know if it was literally his last words, but among his last words towards the end of his life, he reportedly said something like, they all wanted me to be another Washington. And meaning he disappointed everybody, right? They wanted him to set a Republican example like Washington had done. Now, Washington was almost immediately opposed to the Articles of Confederation. He wanted a strong national government from the very beginning. And one of the reasons why is, if you remember, during the Revolution at Valley Forge, Washington had seen his soldiers die and desert because they were unfed, unclothed, they didn't have proper shelter, and it was all because the Continental Congress was too weak to raise enough money to pay for the food and the shelter and the clothing that they needed. And that experience taught him that a stronger national government was necessary, and he believed that throughout the 1780s. If he sent a letter to circulate among the states. It would be passed from state to state, where he told them that he thought the Articles of Confederation was no more than a rope of sand. And if you visualize that, that means no rope at all, right? It did nothing to tie the states together like he wanted, like he thought was necessary. So he believed that the country, the nation, the United States was on the verge of anarchy and confusion, and that it was vulnerable to foreign intervention because it was so weak, and that a national constitution was necessary to unify the states. And then when Shays' Rebellion broke out in 1786, he became even further convinced that a new constitution was needed. So Washington arrived at the Philadelphia Convention in 1787. Benjamin Franklin nominated him to preside or be president of the convention, and he was unanimously elected to do so. He didn't play an active role in the debates of the convention, but he did play an important role in just keeping it together and keeping it on track, and kind of symbolically being the head of the convention. After it was over, he lobbied for the passage or the ratification of the Constitution. He tried to convince his friends and acquaintances like Patrick Henry, who were opposed to it, to support it. And of course, eventually it was ratified. Washington was unanimously selected as the first president. He won the majority of every state's electoral votes. And during the convention, one of the interesting things when they were debating and defining the job for the presidency, they didn't spend a whole lot of time on it because they all just assumed, well, Washington's going to be the first president and he'll sort all that out for himself. So we don't really need to worry as much about that. That's how much trust they had in him, and that's how much confidence they had that he was going to be, it was just assumed that he was going to be the one who would be the president. He was inaugurated on April 30, 1789 at Federal Hall in New York City, and that's what this painting here represents. After his inauguration, he read a speech in the Senate chamber, and this became the precedent for the modern inaugural address. In his speech, he asked that almighty being who rules over the universe, who presides in the councils of nations, and whose providential aids can supply every human defect, consecrate the liberties and happiness of the people of the United States. He wrote to James Madison and said, as the first of everything in our situation will serve to establish a precedent, it is devoutly wished on my part that these precedents be fixed on true principles. So he knew, first, it's interesting that he basically used his inaugural address to pray for providential aids for the liberty and happiness of the people. And he told his friend Madison, he knew he was setting precedents. He was very conscious of the fact that he was the first president and people would look to him for an example of what presidents should or should not do. And so one of the things he did that set an example all the way until today is he told everybody what to call him. At first, they weren't sure. Some of them wanted to call him His Excellency. Some of them wanted to call him His Highness, the President, which were all royal-sounding titles. And he insisted that they just call him Mr. President, which was a very ordinary-sounding way to address him. And that's what he wanted because that was more fitting for a republic, a democracy. He created the first executive cabinet. He created the precedent of sending messages to Congress, and of course the inaugural address. This is Washington's cabinet. He appointed a Virginian, Edmund Randolph, as Attorney General. A man named Samuel Osgood, who's not pictured here actually, was the Postmaster General. Thomas Jefferson, who is pictured here, was the Secretary of State. Henry Knox, who you probably don't recognize, he's over here, was the Secretary of War. And Alexander Hamilton, who's standing in the center, was the Secretary of the Treasury. So this cabinet became a consulting and advisory body. It's not mandated in the Constitution, but because Washington created a cabinet to advise him and to consult with him, it became a thing that all presidents have had since. He did not participate in the debates in his cabinet, but he often would instruct the cabinet to debate things for him so that he could listen and decide who he agreed with and what his opinion would be. He would sometimes request that they give him opinions in writing about things that they were proposing to be done, and I'll give you an example of that in a few minutes. Now, what's interesting and important is that rival parties formed very quickly around two cabinet members who disagreed with each other vehemently on many things. So on the left side of the screen, you see the Secretary of Treasury, Alexander Hamilton, and he and his supporters eventually became the Federalist Party. And on the right, you see the Secretary of State, Thomas Jefferson, and he and his supporters eventually became the Republicans. So the Federalists followed Hamilton, the Republicans followed Jefferson. And Washington himself, although he never belonged to a political party, he did personally side with Hamilton much more often than with Jefferson, and agree with Hamilton on his ideas. This is just a set of general principles that divided Hamilton and Jefferson. You can see they had contrasting views of the federal government. You can start at the top, and this is like the very basic idea. Hamilton was comfortable with concentrating power in the federal government. He wanted a strong federal government. Jefferson very much wanted a limited national government. Jefferson was much more comfortable with having strong state governments instead. And then if you look down a few lines to go along with that, Hamilton had a very loose interpretation of the Constitution and Jefferson a very strict interpretation. And I'll give you an example of that in a few minutes. Hamilton favored having a strong an economy based on shipping and manufacturing. Jefferson was more favorable to farming. And some of the other stuff I'll explain as we go along. One thing that I found interesting about Washington's presidency, we sometimes think, maybe you know the story of the Thanksgiving that we currently celebrate being created by Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. He issued a day of proclamation or proclamation of Thanksgiving, and then it just became a holiday. And we've done it ever since then, the second to last Thursday in November, or however that works. Well, actually, giving proclamations and setting up days of Thanksgiving was a very common thing. It was done throughout the 1600s and 1700s by governors and then by presidents. So Washington proclaimed November 26, 1789, as a day of Thanksgiving to encourage national unity. And he said in his proclamation, "It is the duty of all nations to acknowledge the providence of Almighty God, to obey his will, to be grateful for his benefits, and humbly to implore his protection and favor." And he spent that day fasting and visiting people who were in prison for not being able to pay their debts. And in prison, he gave them food and beer to brighten their spirits. Now, slavery was a contentious issue, of course, during Washington's presidency. There were two anti-slavery petitions presented to Congress during his administration. And Georgia and South Carolina were so angry about them that they threatened civil war. And Washington and Congress responded with some pro-slavery measures to pacify Georgia and South Carolina. So they said natural citizenship was denied to black immigrants. Slaves were barred from serving in state militias. They said that the Southwest Territory, that would eventually become the state of Tennessee, would be allowed to maintain slavery. And they allowed two more slave states, Kentucky and Tennessee, in 1792 and 1796, during Washington's presidency. Probably worst of all, in 1793, Washington signed into law the Fugitive Slave Act, which overrode state laws and courts and allowed agents to cross state lines to capture and return escaped slaves. And many free blacks in the North were angry about the law. They believed it would allow bounty hunting and the kidnapping of free blacks, which it probably did. And this was passed to give effect to the Constitution's Fugitive Slave Clause, and it was passed overwhelmingly in Congress. On the other side, in 1789, Washington signed a new version of the Northwest Ordinance, and it freed all new slaves brought after 1787 into the Ohio River Territory. And then he signed the Slave Trade Act of 1794, which limited American involvement in the slave trade, and he presided over the admittance of Vermont, which was a free state, into the Union in 1791. So the compromise that they came up with was eventually, Hamilton promised them something that they wanted in return. So Jefferson and Madison reluctantly allowed their allies in Congress to go along with Madison's plan to assume the state and national debts and pay them off. And in return, Hamilton agreed to set up the new capital of the United States, what would eventually be Washington, D.C., between Virginia and Maryland. And of course, Virginia was Jefferson's home, and this would mean it was in the South, and it was near to his home. This was important to Madison and Jefferson. They didn't like the capital being in New York City, so far away. Philadelphia was closer, it was better, but they liked the idea of having it in the South, close to where they were from. So that's the Compromise of 1790. That's where we're going to stop for today. Okay, so I'll see you next time. We'll continue from here. I think it's going to make more sense if I do this. So in 1790, Hamilton issued a report on the public credit, and this was like a message to Congress, but also a bit of research had gone into it. He wanted to explain to them what the status was of the national debt and the state debts. And a lot of these national and state debts went all the way back to the Revolution, when they were going into debt in order to win independence from Great Britain. And he found that the nation was $54 million in debt, and the states were $25 million in debt. And a lot of these debts were sort of like IOUs that had been given to soldiers instead of payment, and things like that. Now, something freaky had happened, or something complicated had happened. So imagine, I'm simplifying it, but they had given to soldiers, for example, certificates that were basically IOUs, saying this is redeemable for $100. But remember what I told you about continental dollars. They became worthless during the war. And during the war and after the war, especially in the 1780s, a lot of the people who owned these certificates saw the condition of the Continental Congress, that it couldn't raise money and it couldn't pay its debts, and they decided that these things were worthless and they were never going to get them back. They were not going to get the money that they had been promised. So they sold them to speculators for a fraction of their face value. In other words, an investor would come along and he would say, that $100 certificate you have is worthless because you know Congress is never going to actually pay you that money. I'll give you $10 for it, and that's better than nothing. All right? And the soldiers would say, okay, I'm broke, $10 is better than nothing. They would hand over the certificate in exchange for the $10. And then the investors would just hold on to this in hoping that someday Congress really would pay its debts. And if it did, they'd get a windfall, right? They would get the $90 difference to keep for themselves as profit. Well, along comes Alexander Hamilton, and he says the nation is $54 million in debt, and the states are $25 million in debt. And a lot of these debts are now in the hands of banks and speculators who've bought them up for a fraction of their original price. And his recommendation is that Congress now assume all of those debts and promise to pay them back at full face value. Now, why does he want to do that? Why doesn't he say, let's pay them back for a quarter of their face value? Let's pay them back for 50% of their face value. He wants to establish a good credit rating for the United States right off the bat. I don't think they had credit ratings in those days, but the equivalent thereof, right? He wanted investors around the world, banks, to say, oh, the United States pays its debts and doesn't pay them like halfway, it pays the full value of the debt. And this would make people more likely to loan the United States money in the future. He also figured if we promise to pay to the banks and the merchants the full value of those certificates, they will have an interest in the survival of our government. Right? They won't want the government to collapse because they'll want to get that money that's now been promised to them. So they'll be on our side in a sense. They'll have a stake in the outcome of the American government's success. Well, Hamilton proposed this idea, but Madison and Jefferson were opposed. Madison and Jefferson, first of all, they thought about these guys who were in many cases veterans, and they said, well, what about these guys? They got cheated, right? They got cheated 90% of what was paid to them, and Madison was hopeful that they could find some way to pay back these people what they had originally been promised, but it turned out that was unworkable. It just couldn't really be done. Jefferson hated the idea of going into debt in the first place. Jefferson thought this was just awful to have the United States right off the bat be indebted to banks and merchants. Just seemed to him like a terrible idea because then they would be the ones literally controlling the country. They would be the ones in power, and he didn't think he was just uncomfortable with that whole idea. So I'm going to start with the first bank of the United States, and it was a huge controversy for 50 years, and obviously controversies about banks and their role in the economy have never gone away. There are some people who still dislike the Federal Reserve for a lot of the same reasons you're going to hear about, that people dislike the first bank of the United States. So, there it is. So the first bank was proposed by Alexander Hamilton. Remember I told you that Hamilton was the Secretary of the Treasury and Jefferson was the Secretary of State, and they disagreed with each other on just about everything. And this was one of the most important disagreements. So Hamilton had a lot of reasons to propose this. First, the bank itself it was created, it would be a private institution, but 1/5 of the stock would be owned by the national government, and the stock would be borrowed from the bank itself. So the government would borrow money from the bank in order to buy 1/5 of the stock in the bank. All right. So imagine that the bank had $1 million worth of stock. I'm just making up that number. I don't remember how much it was. The government would borrow $200,000 from the bank right off the bat. And so it would owe that money to the bank, and it would use that money to buy stock in the bank. Hamilton thought this was a brilliant idea because he wanted the U.S. to acquire debt. Remember I mentioned that the other day. He thought this would make bankers and merchants interested in the outcome of the American government and the stability of the American government, so they would fight for it. He also thought it would be a great chance for the U.S. government to prove that it was creditworthy, so it would get loans in the future if it needed them. All sorts of things. Jefferson thought this was horrible. This was horrifying. The idea that you would start right off the bat with a huge debt just made no sense to him. And so you also get arguments that we still have today about whether or not it's a good thing for the U.S. to be in debt. And Hamilton would have said, sure, no problem. And Jefferson would have said, no, that's crazy. But so the bank would be a private institution, 1/5 of the stock owned by the national government. It would be the main depository for U.S. funds, so the Treasury would deposit money in the bank. It would issue currency and provide loans. And Hamilton wanted the bank to be able to provide loans for things like manufacturing, for industry. He hoped that the U.S. would get a kickstart in industry through this. So the one of the main differences, maybe the main difference, was that Madison and Jefferson thought that this idea was unconstitutional. So nowhere in the Constitution does it specifically say that Congress has the authority to charter corporations, much less charter banks. And the bank would have been a corporation, right? A private corporation. And so Jefferson said, Article 1, Section 8 lists all the powers of Congress. It says the things that you can do. It doesn't list this. So sorry, you can't charter corporations. You can't create banks. Hamilton said there's a necessary and proper clause. In Article 1, Section 8, it says Congress can do anything that is necessary and proper to carrying out its specifically listed powers. And those listed powers include the power to tax, the power to borrow money, the power to coin money, and Hamilton argued a bank is necessary for those things. It's proper for those things, and therefore it can be done. Well, Washington agreed with Hamilton. He asked them both for written opinions on the topic, and they both gave them to him. Hamilton's was more persuasive to Washington, so he signed the law and the bank was created. Jefferson, just to go back for just a second on Jefferson's problem with the bank, what Jefferson and Hamilton were articulating were ideas for how to interpret our Constitution and the powers of government that still matter today. In other words, there are still Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians depending on how you think about the Constitution and how you think about the federal government. When Jefferson said Congress can't do more than what it's specifically given the power to do in the Constitution, he wanted Congress to have very limited powers, right? And only those powers that were specifically given to it. He said to take a single leap beyond the boundaries thus specifically drawn around the powers of Congress is to take possession of a boundless field of power no longer susceptible to definition. So to kind of dumb it down, Jefferson was saying, yes, you have the power to coin money, and you have the power to borrow, and you have the power to spend. There's no question about these. They're listed right there in the document, in the Constitution. But it doesn't list to create a bank. It doesn't list to charter corporations. So Hamilton said, yeah, but those are implied. And Jefferson said, well, once you start saying Congress can do things that are implied, well, anything could be implied. There's no longer any way to define or limit the powers of Congress. You've just now created a loophole that would allow Congress to do anything it wants, according to Jefferson. That's what he was afraid of. And arguably, not right away, but a couple of hundred years later, he was pretty much right. So Hamilton's view is the one that prevailed at the time and arguably ever since. Hamilton said that the necessary and proper clause justified issuing charters to national banks. He said if the end be clearly comprehended within any of the specified powers, collecting taxes and regulating the currency, and if the measure have an obvious relation to that end and is not forbidden by any particular provision of the Constitution, it may safely be deemed to come within the compass of the national authority. So, if chartering a bank is related to coining money, borrowing money, spending money, and it's not prohibited by the Bill of Rights or something else, then it's okay. That's Hamilton's argument, and his argument prevailed. Back to this argument on national debt. So Hamilton wanted the U.S. to acquire a national debt through his proposal to charter a bank. He wanted the government to acquire good credit. He wanted the wealthy, the bankers, the merchants, the investors to invest in the government and be committed to its survival. Jefferson said, however, it is incumbent on every generation to pay its own debts as it goes, a principle which, if acted on, would save one half the wars of the world. Now, that's an interesting argument. I don't think Well, some people at the time thought that debt, in a sense, drove us into World War One. So they were Jeffersonians then. Jefferson would be appalled at today's government. Does anyone know how much money the federal government owes today? I'm sorry? Oh, much, much more than that.
36 trillion.
I'm sorry?
36 trillion.
Thank you. That sounds better. I lost track after 20 trillion. It just got too depressing for me to keep up with, so I stopped counting.
I thought it used to be just like 3 trillion.
Yeah, 40 years ago. Yeah. It has been doubling every 8 years for about 40 years, if I remember correctly. So it was about 1.5 trillion or so. I'm just roughly at the end of Reagan's term, around 89 or maybe 92 when George Bush Sr. left office. Then it was about 3 trillion when Clinton left office. Then it was about 5 or 6 trillion when Bush left office. Then it was about 11 trillion when Obama left office. When Trump left office, it was somewhere around 20 to 22, maybe 25, and it's just kept skyrocketing ever since. So something interesting is going to happen eventually. And when I say interesting, I mean catastrophic. But so Jefferson was horrified by that sort of thing. He thought every generation, every political generation, should pay its own debts, not leave anything for future generations to pay off. Otherwise, you might have a disaster. They also disagreed on what kind of economy they wanted to have. So Jefferson had this kind of nostalgic or old-fashioned view. Jefferson wanted farming, agriculture, to be the center of the economy. And as a matter of fact, agriculture probably was the base of the economy for many, many years in the United States. Hamilton wanted America to have an industrialized economy like Great Britain did, with manufacturing and so forth, and with banking as well. He wanted that kind of an economy. What's interesting about Jefferson's ideas is he thought that the good thing about small farmers is that they owned their own land and they worked for themselves. And therefore, in his view, they weren't dependent upon anyone else for their food or their livelihood. And therefore, in a sense, they were not slaves to anyone else. He said, if you're dependent upon someone else, either to pay your salary or to provide you food, he said, dependence begets subservience and venality, suffocates the germ of virtue, and prepares fit tools for the designs of ambition. In other words, if I work in a factory for a boss who pays me, $1 an hour or whatever it was in those days, I am dependent upon that person. I am, in a sense, I don't have freedom, right? Because that person not only pays my salary, but could render me homeless and destitute and poor at any moment, right? With no warning. But if I have my own land and I grow my own food and I'm a farmer, then I'm dependent only on myself, which is kind of maybe a simplistic view of it, but that was his idea. So in 1791, Hamilton issued a report on manufactures. And in this, he recommended that the federal government subsidize manufacturers to help them compete with foreign competitors and fund transportation projects like roads and canals. Jefferson and Madison and other Republicans in Congress helped stop these proposals from being enacted. Jefferson and Madison preferred what we call a laissez-faire approach to the economy. He believed that government subsidies of manufacturing and transportation would only benefit those who were already wealthy and well-connected. So this is yet another argument where nothing has changed. Today we are still Jeffersonians and Hamiltonians. So some people say, wouldn't it be great if we had a green economy? I'm not taking sides on this, I'm just giving you this as a current example of the same kind of debate. And the way we can have a green economy, the Hamiltonians say, is we will subsidize some businesses that use solar energy, wind power, businesses that involve maybe recycling, I don't know, stuff like that. And what do I mean by subsidize? I mean the government will give those businesses money, right, to help them compete in the market. It'll give them either tax deductions that the other businesses don't have to pay, or it'll just give them, just flat out give them checks so that solar power can compete with oil and coal and other types of power, natural gas. The Jeffersonians will say, no, 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 no. You're interfering with the market. What you should have is a laissez-faire approach, which means let it be. Let it go. Don't touch it. If these things are good, they'll survive on their own without your help, if they're necessary, if they're useful. If they're not, then you're just wasting money by throwing it at stuff that wasn't a good idea to begin with. And also, the Jeffersonians will say, if you subsidize these businesses, because governments tend towards corruption, the money, the subsidies will just go to people who have friends in high places, right? It'll breed corruption, right? And that was his fear. So these two opposed each other on almost everything. Banking, what kind of government, how to interpret the Constitution, what kind of economy they thought the U.S. should have, whether or not the government should subsidize businesses or have a free market. And they fought constantly. And at the end of Washington's first term, around December of 1793, Jefferson resigned his position of Secretary of State and left the government. And by 1794 or so, there were fairly clear Federalist and Republican parties that had formed around the two men and were competing against each other in elections. The Federalists formed around Hamilton and the Republicans around Jefferson. Now, in 1791, Congress, at Hamilton's urging, imposed an excise tax on distilled spirits. In other words, a tax on whiskey. In Pennsylvania, especially in the western frontier districts of Pennsylvania, farmers protested somewhat violently against these taxes. And they compared this to the excessive taxation that helped cause the Revolutionary War about 20 years earlier. They weren't sure what to do about it. Washington wasn't sure. He called on Pennsylvania state officials to intervene and restore the peace. They declined. They didn't want to do anything. They were sympathetic to the farmers. So he issued a proclamation calling for state militias, calling them up. And he also issued a statement reminding the protesters that unlike in the example of the American Revolution, here the taxes had been passed by their own representatives. In other words, the old no taxation without representation slogan didn't apply. They might not like the taxes, but at least they had had a say in voting for the representatives who created them. So the threats and the violence escalated. It was aimed at tax collectors in Pennsylvania, people trying to collect the whiskey tax. And in 1794, Washington actually took the field with an army of about 10 to 15,000. This was the first and only time that an American president has actually led soldiers into the field. There was no battle, though. As soon as Washington showed up in Pennsylvania with 10 or 15,000 soldiers, the rebellion just disappeared, and one or two people were arrested. Washington later pardoned them, so nobody ended up even being punished. But one of the most interesting things about this from a historical standpoint is it set a firm precedent that under the Constitution and with the new office of the presidency, the federal government could restore order. If there was a rebellion, Washington or whoever the president was could step in and put it down. Remember, the Shays Rebellion had happened just 8 years earlier, and the federal government, the Continental Congress, had been useless. They couldn't stop the rebellion. They had no money. They had no army. And so they just stood around and watched. And here, Washington was able to put down the rebellion without even firing a shot. Another important part of Washington's administration, there were two treaties that were worth remembering. One was the Jay Treaty, and the issues that it was meant to solve, it was a treaty between the United States and Britain, and there were a couple of issues. One of the issues, for example, the British had not removed their soldiers from forts in the American Northwest. They had promised to do so at the end of the American Revolution, but they had ignored that promise. They also weren't allowing American merchants to trade in the British West Indies. They were just closing them out. And so John Jay was one of the guys who wrote the Federalist Papers. He was, I think he was the first or one of the first Supreme Court Chief Justices. He was sent to negotiate this treaty, and the solution he came back with, the treaty he came back with, was deeply unpopular. Washington supported it because it did a couple of things. Mainly, it avoided war with Great Britain. And Great Britain promised to abandon its forts, even though it lingered for many years about doing so. And they also agreed to open the British West Indies to American merchants so Americans could trade there. Jeffersonian Republicans were angry about the treaty. They wanted more concessions from Great Britain. And right about this time, Britain and France were at war. And remember, France had been America's ally in the Revolution. Britain, of course, had been America's enemy. And so the Jeffersonians sided with France, and they disliked the appearance that America, with this treaty, was making peace with the British and moving closer towards a relationship with them. France didn't like it either. They interpreted this treaty as a betrayal of their alliance with us from back during the Revolution. Another treaty that was important was the Pinckney Treaty. This was in 1795. And here, the 31st parallel, which runs around here, was recognized as the boundary between the southern United States and, right here, I think, and Florida. And Florida remained a Spanish territory. But the most important part of this treaty was this Mississippi River that you see over here. So at the time, Baton Rouge and New Orleans, this was all Spanish territory. But Spain gave the United States permission to use New Orleans and the Mississippi River as a port. American farmers could send their crops down the Mississippi River, and they could be sent out to sea through the port at New Orleans. And this way they could engage in international commerce. If Spain kept New Orleans blocked off so American farmers couldn't use it, that would have meant war, because it would have meant economic death to American farmers west of the Appalachian Mountains. So this was a very good treaty, very popular treaty. I'm going to skip this issue because I want to get on to some other things. So I'll skip Northwest Frontier for now. So Washington, after his first term, wanted to retire. He was feeling old and tired and frustrated by the partisanship between Jefferson and Hamilton. He was very upset about the emergence of political parties. He didn't like that. Everybody urged him not to retire, especially Madison, Jefferson, Hamilton. They all agreed that only he was popular enough to keep the country united, despite the divisions that were beginning to emerge. So he reluctantly agreed to serve one more term, and did so. What is So the Electoral College unanimously re-elected him president on February 13, 1793. He was sworn in on March 4, 1793, and this is where he resided in Philadelphia during those years. Now, I mentioned that war had begun between France and Great Britain. This was a byproduct of the French Revolution. So the French Revolution began in the late 1780s, early 1790s. Jefferson's Republicans tended to side with the revolutionaries and have mostly positive feelings about the French Revolution. Hamilton's Federalists tended to be horrified by the French Revolution. Does anyone remember anything about the French Revolution? Anything interesting that happened during the French Revolution? What? Yes, you all got the main idea that I was hoping you would have. Lots of violence, right? The guillotine comes to us from the French Revolution, and it was used prolifically, and it was used on the king and the queen, Marie Antoinette. And probably the most famous fact about the French Revolution, one of the most interesting, is that the revolutionaries themselves ended up being victims of the guillotine. It got so violent, so chaotic, that Robespierre himself ended up losing his life, and even though he was one of the most enthusiastic killers of others. So all of that horrified Hamilton and Washington. They thought this was just mob rule and chaos and terrorism. The word terrorist comes to us from the French Revolution. That's Robespierre, his gift to all of us. But the Republicans thought, hey, we need to get rid of the kings and queens. Monarchy has to go. If it takes a few executions, so what? Washington, when the French Revolution, though, spilled into wars with Great Britain and other countries, Washington wanted the United States to remain strictly neutral. So he issued a proclamation in 1793 and said America would have a conduct friendly and impartial toward the belligerent powers. And remember, we had a treaty with France, a Treaty of Alliance from 1778. So France felt betrayed, and the Republicans felt betrayed because they wanted to maintain that alliance with France and be on their side in the war against Great Britain. But Washington knew, and Hamilton knew, that America did not have the strength, financially or militarily, to go to war against major powers like that at this time. So the French sent a diplomat named Citizen Genet to America. And he was welcomed with great enthusiasm by American crowds, by the Republicans who were sympathetic to him. And he was openly hostile towards Washington's neutrality policy. And he proceeded to recruit American ships to be privateers. In other words, they would be like pirates attacking British ships at sea, but with French authority. He would give them papers like legalizing their behavior on the part of France. This outraged Washington. He saw this correctly as interfering with our neutrality and interfering with our sovereignty, basically. And so he ordered Genet to go. And he ordered the French government to remove him, which they did. But interestingly, Genet, when he was removed from his post as diplomat, he didn't go back to France. Instead, he moved to New York and lived the rest of his life there as a farmer. Why didn't he go back to France? He probably saw people were getting killed left and right there. Better just stay here. Another really important thing that happened towards the end of Washington's presidency, or during Washington's presidency, I just saved it towards the end, is this, the letter to the Hebrew congregation at Newport. I mentioned several weeks ago that Rhode Island was a haven for Jews who were persecuted around the world, including in South America. And so there was a Hebrew or Jewish congregation in Rhode Island very early on in the country's history, in the 1600s or 1700s, so one of the oldest congregations in America. And when Washington became president, the congregation wrote a letter to him and basically asked, what can we expect? Now that we have a new constitution, a new form of government, where do the Jews fit in with this new order? And Washington wrote back. He said, the citizens of the United States of America have a right to applaud themselves for having given to mankind examples of an enlarged and liberal policy, a policy worthy of imitation. All possess alike liberty of conscience and immunities of citizenship. It is now no more that toleration is spoken of as if it were the indulgence of one class of people that another enjoyed the exercise of their inherent natural rights. For happily, the government of the United States, which gives to bigotry no sanction, to persecution no assistance, requires only that they who live under its protection should demean themselves as good citizens, and giving it on all occasions their effectual support. Now, what does all that mean? When he says it is now no more that toleration is spoken of, he's saying your citizenship is just the same as mine. And so the fact that we have different religions is no longer relevant. And it's not that you will be tolerated because you're not any different, right, in any meaningful way from anybody else. And this letter has been, if I remember right, they actually kept a copy of the letter, maybe still have it if it hasn't been turned over to a museum. But it's read at least once a year in this congregation. They reread it at least once a year to sort of celebrate or remember receiving it from George Washington over 200 years ago. So Washington decided to retire at the end of his second term. And this set a precedent that lasted for 150 years, that presidents would only serve 2 terms. The only president who broke that precedent was Franklin Delano Roosevelt, and almost immediately after his presidency, the Constitution was changed to make it formal that you can only have 2 terms as president. And so that tradition began with George Washington, just one of the many ways that he set principles or precedents that future presidents were expected to follow. Before he left, he wrote, or maybe Alexander Hamilton wrote for him, a farewell address. There are 3 things that he expressed in this farewell address that I want to focus to you. 3 dangers, I would say. 3 things he wanted to warn Americans about. What's interesting is that in some ways, maybe all 3 of these things continue to be themes that are important, even today. So the first danger is he warned about the danger of sectionalism. And what he meant was regionalism. He meant people who think of their region as their true identity, their true home, rather than the national identity. He said the name of American, which belongs to you and your national capacity, must always exalt the just pride and patriotism more than any appellation derived from local discriminations. So in his day, people were starting to think of themselves as Southerners, Northerners, Westerners, and he was afraid that those regional identifications would tear the country apart. And of course, he was right. It did result in a civil war 70 years later. Today, it might be different kinds of identifications, maybe by class or ethnicity or other things, but he would be just as concerned about that. The second thing he warned was about partisanship. He was really alarmed at the development of political parties, and he had the same basic concern, that people were now identifying themselves as Republicans and Federalists, and he feared that this was becoming more important than people's common identity as Americans, and that it was also driving them apart. Last, he warned about foreign entanglements or permanent alliances. He counseled friendship and commerce with all nations, but advised against involvement in foreign affairs. So many people talk about how this is where an American policy or an American idea of isolationism began. What Washington said was, be very wary about making permanent alliances with other countries, because if you do, you will be dragged into their wars, and those wars might have no real you might have no real business being involved with. So today, I would ask, are we involved in any permanent alliances? Yes, of course we are, right? NATO is probably the most obvious example. What? We have alliances with Canada. Canada is a part of NATO. Many other countries are. And those are military alliances. A war on one, an attack on one is an attack on all. There is something, I think it's Article 5 of the NATO Compact. I think it's Article 5. That says an attack on one is attack on all. So if France is invaded, for example, by Russia, then legally we are obligated to defend it, to go to war. And Washington didn't want that sort of thing. He said this will get you dragged into wars that you really don't have any business being a part of, that are really none of your concern. He also said something really interesting. He said, never mistake other countries for your friends. He said they have their own interests and they have their own goals, and sometimes those align with yours, but it doesn't really make you friends, right? They're always going to do what's best for them, and you should always keep your eye on what's best for you. So that means right now we have very strong relationships with Great Britain. We have very strong relationships with Canada, with Israel, with some other countries. He would say that's great, but don't think they're really your friends, because as soon as your interests diverge, they're going to do what's best for them, and you should do what's best for you. So those three things he was concerned about and he talked about in his farewell address. So he retired to Mount Vernon. In 1798, he was briefly almost led back into public service. Relations between the United States and France had deteriorated, and to the point where we were involved in what was called a quasi-war with France, an undeclared war at sea. And there was fear that we would have an actual land war against France. And so President Adams, John Adams, asked Washington if he would be commander-in-chief of the American army in the event of a war with France, and Washington agreed on the condition that Alexander Hamilton be his second command, because he knew he was too old to really do a lot of the work himself, and he wanted someone he trusted to do it with him. But war never broke out, so the danger passed, and he did not have to see actual military action again. So Washington died in 1799, and the actual facts, the circumstances of his death are kind of interesting. On December 12, 1799, he went out to inspect his farms at Mount Vernon on horseback. He returned home late that night and had guests over for dinner. And the next day he complained about a sore throat, but he kept working. The next night, I guess this would be December 13, he complained of congestion in his chest, but was still basically okay. But then he woke up on Saturday with an inflamed throat, and it was difficult for him to breathe. So he had the family estate overseer do something which will sound strange to you today, but was common practice then. He asked the overseer to let his blood out, right? To actually make an incision and let him bleed out about a pint of blood. And then they summoned 3 doctors, and the doctors continued the process of bloodletting, taking out approximately 5 pints of his blood, which almost certainly weakened him to the point of killing him. This was common practice back then. The ideas that they had were sort of medieval ideas that if you were sick, it was because there was some sort of imbalance in your bodily fluids or humors, or what they called them. And so letting blood out might restore that balance somehow, or let out the blood that had been contaminated. I don't know what the idea was. Now, what's interesting is one of the 3 doctors proposed a tracheotomy, which would be a tiny hole incision to allow him to breathe, which may have made a real difference. But the other 2 doctors were like, no, that's crazy. We don't want to do wild stuff like that. let's just keep taking blood out of the patient. That'll make him feel better. So they didn't do the tracheotomy that might have saved him. A little bit later, he said, "Doctor, I die hard, but I am not afraid to go." And then at some point, around 10 to 11 p.m. on December the 14th, his wife Martha was sitting near him, and his last words were, "'Tis well," and he died. When he died, there was, national mourning. There was a eulogy given for him and a ceremony given for him at Congress, at the Capitol. One of his best friends was named Henry Lighthorse Harry Lee, who was the father of Robert E. Lee, who would go on to lead the Confederate armies in the Civil War. And Lighthorse Harry Lee wrote the eulogy, which became famous. He said, "First in war, first in peace, and first in the hearts of his countrymen, he was second to none in the humble and endearing scenes of private life, pious, just, humane, temperate, and sincere, uniform, dignified, and commanding. His example was as edifying to all around him as were the effects of that example lasting." So in the famous phrase, "first in war, first in peace," I think first in war means the American Revolution, where he led the country to victory. First in peace, he was the first president, right, who established the peace after the war. So a little bit about Washington's legacy. During his lifetime, people began to call Washington the father of the country. As early as when's the first reference I could find? In 1776, a guy named Levi Allen called Washington our political father and head of a great people. In 1777, this is during the war, Henry Knox, who would later be the Secretary of War, said, "The people of America look up to you as their father, and into your hands they entrust their all." A German almanac in Pennsylvania in 1778 called Washington des Landesvater, or father of the country. And Knox again in 1787 urged Washington to show up at the Constitutional Convention and said the country would doubly entitle you to the glorious Republican epithet, the father of your country. After he was inaugurated president in 1789, it became common for newspapers and officials to refer to him as the father of the people and the father of the country. And that designation has lasted in many ways until this day. A couple of other things. I found this question interesting. Should we celebrate Washington's birthday? And the question arose in my mind because we used to. After his death, it became very common informally for Americans to celebrate his birthday, February the 22nd, every year. It became something like a national holiday, but informally. It wasn't a formal federal holiday until 1889, when Congress declared it a federal holiday, and federal employees took February 22nd off work every year to celebrate Washington's birthday. In Laredo, I don't know if any of you are from Laredo or have been to Laredo, they have a famous Washington's birthday celebration. They started in 1898, one of the most interesting celebrations in the country. It's a huge thing, and not just the city of Laredo, but actually Nuevo Laredo, they all take part, and they have a reenactment of the Boston Tea Party for some reason. Washington wasn't there, but because they thought, what the heck, why not? They have dances, they have ceremonies, all sorts of stuff goes on. And it's been 130 years almost that they've been doing that. Now, about 50 years ago, we stopped celebrating Washington's birthday on February 22nd. Congress moved it to the third Monday of every February. So not the 22nd, but just the third Monday, whenever that happened to be. And everybody started calling it President's Day. And it sort of merged Washington's birthday and Lincoln's birthday. But some people think that was a mistake. Instead of just having a generic president's birthday, we should celebrate Washington's birthday individually, the way we used to back in the 1800s, 1900s, and the way Laredo still does today. Some people think we shouldn't celebrate Washington or his birthday at all. So there are people who think that we should remove statues of him, remove monuments to him. In 2020, there was a big spate of statue removal and destruction and crowds tearing them down all over the country. And Washington was one of the targets of these. On the left, you see Maryland. There was a statue of him in the park, and someone put red spray paint over the top of it and wrote BLM, Black Lives Matter, on the bottom. On the right, you see a statue of him from New Orleans, and again, the same thing, someone splattered paint over it. Here in the middle is a statue of Washington on a horse, and on the bottom, they wrote slave owner on one side. And reactions to this sort of thing were mixed. In Chicago, the local newspaper interviewed a couple of people. One was a black activist in the city who said, take down all the statues to slave owners, just get rid of them all. On the other, a black history professor at one of the Chicago universities said, no, leave it up, but just talk about his legacy of the good and the bad, the slave owning and the other stuff, and be, I guess, truthful about all of it. So it's an interesting controversy that erupted a few years ago and maybe has not really gone away. That's it for today. I'll see you next time.